Hello, this is Josh Bryant here with Elitefts and JoshStrength.com. I get asked a lot about my deadlifting mentality, psychology, the programming I do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it and 5 mentors that were very influential in my deadlift philosophy. The first one was named Steve Hall. Steve Hall was a powerlifter. He took me under he was my dad's best friend. He took me under his wing when I was 14 years old. I remember the first conversation we had at the gym. He said, look around this place. You see the same people using the same reps, same sets, same weights over and over on the same exercises. He said they look the same, they lift the same for the last 10, 15 years. He said, I just remember he looked at me and said, whatever you do, put more weight on the bar. Then he talked a little more. He said, I don't care if you decrease your rest interval, you add a rep, add a set, put more weight on the bar. He just beat into my head that you have to continually increase intensity if you want to make progress. You can't just keep doing the same weights over and over and expect to make progress. You know, a lot of people sort of talk nowadays about kind of how like progressive overload is dead, and it's really not, because even if you use sort of like if you use a conjugate method, for instance, say, you know, you do a block pull this week, a deficit pull this week, whatever you're doing, when you come back to that same exercise, your goal is to beat your own PR. So it's not just a straight linear progressive overload, but the bottom line is when you get back to it, you're trying to progressively overload what you did before. And Steve Hall, he used to yell at me before I deadlift. He'd say, commit to the pull. He would just beat in my head. He said, I don't care if your back breaks, you do not let go of that bar, and you need to commit to that pull. And Steve taught me the mentality of committing to the pull and always making sure you increase intensity. Next mentor I had was Ed Cowan. I never actually had the pleasure of training with Ed in person, but I talked to him on and off since I was in high school. And Ed was very systematic in how he approached everything. You know, so he really taught me, you know, the committing to the pull, being aggressive, all that's great, but you have to have a plan. And Ed helped me set up a plan, and I'd talk with him and tell him what I was going to do, and he'd kind of check over what I was doing. He's very influential and really made me into a planner. The next person I had the pleasure of actually training with for a number of years was George Brink. George was the first person over 50 years old to ever pull 800. And George was not just a gym lifter. He taught the mentality of how to compete. Prior to pulling 804, George's best deadlift ever in the gym was 705. He went to a meet and pulled 100 pounds more, and it wasn't because he dogged it in training. I mean, he trained very hard. And what I learned from George was he had done, you know, at that age, he was still doing like old school finished deadlift routines with a ton of volume. So I learned from George a lot about volume, hard work, and then also from George the importance of deficit pulls. George was big time into deficit pulls, and even though like his starting strength wasn't his strong point, he really brought it up with a lot of deficit pulls, and that's what I gained from him. He had no excuses type attitude. Next person I trained was Gary Frank. I moved to Louisiana to train with Gary Frank, and there was one constant thing I got from Gary Frank. It wasn't so much certain set, certain rep, any type of particular training variable, but there's one thing I learned from him was speed. Every time I'd walk up to the bar, he would yell speed, and he would always reiterate to me that I'm not built to deadlift, and I'm never going to be a great deadlifter unless I focus on speed. And I remember one day we were talking when I first got there, about like a lot of powerlifters kind of warned against me when I'd start the deadlift rolling the bar, because that was kind of an unconventional way to do it. But he rolled the bar, and he says, you get more speed when you roll the bar. I'm like, yeah. And he's like, well, why are you listening to them? He's like, they ain't deadlifted 900, brah. And he was. So I listened. He kind of taught me, to do, make sure it works for me. And, picking up that speed was huge from him. Last person I had the pleasure of training was Paul Leonard. Paul was very systematic in what he did, like Ed Cowan. And more importantly, Paul, kind of reiterated the point of deloading, because sometimes I'd be going so hard, so long, and kind of run into a rut. And then Paul, he had some success with deloading. He kind of talked to me about it, and that was very helpful in my own lifting career and the programming of others.